October 1948, Donora, Pennsylvania, a small steel town on the Monongahela. Riverby Day, its skies were never blue. Smoke from the mills painted the air gray, the taste of metal on every breath. Children grew up drawing pictures with black skies, not knowing the world was any different. Industry meant survival. The furnaces never slept, and the town lived and died by the smoke. But that autumn, something changed. The fog rolled in. At first it seemed normal. This was Donora after all. Fog and soot were part of life. But this fog didn't live. It thickened, it turned yellow, it pressed down like a lid, sealing the town in a coffin of air. By the second night, people began to cough violently, clutching their chests. Horses collapsed in the streets. Birds fell from the sky. Hospitals overflowed, and still the mills refused to stop burning. Neighbors wrapped wet towels over their faces. Families sealed their windows with rags. Some huddled in dark rooms praying for morning, but morning never brought relief. The fog stayed for 5 days. Donora suffocated, and by the time the smog finally lifted, 20 people were dead, thousands were sick, and the world would never look at the air the same way again. This is not just the story of a town, it is the story of what happens when progress poisons the very air we breathe. This is the story of Donora, the American town that choked to death. Donora, Pennsylvania, a river town carved into the hills of the Monongahela Valley by the early 20th century. Donora was no ordinary community. It was an engine of American industry. The Donora Zinc Works, the American Steel and Wire Plant, their chimneys belched smoke day and night, pumping prosperity into a town that relied on steel like blood in its veins. A bird in its veins. The air was never clean. Those wasn't a burden, it was the price of survival. Locals used to joke, if you can't see across the street, business must be good. Children grew up under skies so black with soot they played baseball beneath clouds of smoke. Their uniforms were streaked gray before the first inning was done. Housewives hung laundry, only to see it stained before it dried. Cars rusted faster, windows stayed shut, even in summer, because dust coated everything, but no one complained. The mills gave them food jobs, and a future in Donora. Smoke was normal. Smoke was life. A reporter once described it as a town where the sky was never blue. To outsiders, the choking haze seemed dystopian. To those who lived there, it was simply home. Every day began with the blast of the mill whistle. Thousands of men poured into the plants. The zinc works roared like a beast that never slept, swallowing coals, spitting fire and belching fumes that wrapped the town in a permanent twilight. Inside, workers endured brutal conditions, heat that seared the lungs, sweat mixing with metal dust, shifts that stretched into exhaustion. And yet, the paycheck meant survival. For every family, the factory was both the provider and the executioner. Even the river bore the scars. The Monongahela, once clear, ran dark with waste, reflecting the grey sky above it. Birds rarely nested in Donorand when visitors came. Many left quickly, unable to bear the sting in their throats or the burn in their eyes. But Donorans said they had built their lives around the mills. They endured the sting of pollution with pride, telling themselves it was the cost of progress, the American cost. No one could imagine that the same smoke which fed the town would one day suffocate it. And in October of 1948, when the fog descended and refused to lift, Donora learned the price of breathing steel. October 26, 1948, the fog rolled into Donora like it always had. At first, no one paid attention. Fog was common in the valley. Trapped by the hills, weighed down by the Monongahela River, the townspeople had lived with mist and smoke for generations. But this fog was different. By nightfall, it turned yellow, thick, heavy. It pressed itself into every corner of the town, into kitchens, bedrooms, schools. Curtains couldn't keep it out, windows did nothing. It seeped under doors and clung to the lungs of anyone who dared breathe. One resident later said it was like breathing hot soup, thick, poisonous soup. The next morning the nightmare began. Children woke, coughing, their throats burning. Horses collapsed in the streets. Birds fell from the sky. Pets died in their yards. and still the fog thickened by October 27th. Visibility was gone, cars crawled at walking pace, buses refused to run. People stretched their hands in front of their faces and could not see their fingers. A Donora. Steelworker wrote in his diary, "I walked home, but it was like stumbling through a cave. My chest was on fire, the air felt alive. Like it was pushing back, hospitals filled almost instantly, nurses wrapped patients in oxygen tents, but supplies ran out within hours. Doctors begged for masks and equipment. There weren't enough beds, not enough medicine, not enough air. Funeral homes began to fill as quickly as the hospital wards. By October 28th, the town was choking. Literally, men collapsed on their way to work. Mothers clutched their children, unsure if the next breath would be their last. Doors stayed shut, lights flickered dimly through the haze, and the whole town seemed wrapped in a suffocating cocoon. One nurse recalled, "We couldn't see the end of the hallway. We couldn't see the patients coming in until they were right in front of us. All we could hear was coughing. Endless coughing. The smog didn't care if you were strong or weak, old or young. The vulnerable first. The elderly, the sick, the asthmatic. But soon even the healthy were doubled over, clutching their chests." Say child's letter found later read simply, "Mama, my chest hurts. Can we leave now?" But there was nowhere to go. The valley had become a trap. The hills locked the smoke in, the factories kept burning, the fog refused to lift. For 5 endless days. Donora suffocated. By the end, nearly half the town's 14,000 residents had fallen. Ill thousands gasped for air in their homes, and dozens would never breathe again. The week the air turned deadly would leave Donora scarred forever, and as the bodies were counted, the question rose like the smoke itself. How could this have happened in America? By October 29th, Donora was no longer a town. It was a trap. The yellow smog had thickened into something you could taste. Metallic, bitter, choking, it clung to clothes. It seeped into food. It filled the lungs like liquid fire. Families tore sheets from their beds, soaking them in water and pressing them to their mouths in a desperate attempt to filter the air. Children walked with rags tied around their faces like makeshift masks. Sold men stumbled down Main Street, coughing until their knees buckled. The town of 14,000 was gasping for survival, but the mills never stopped. Their steelworks roared, the zinc furnaces belched smoke, and the stacks kept pumping poison into the air. Workers pleaded for them to shut down, just for a day, just until the fog cleared. But the answer came back cold. The furnaces could not be allowed to cool, production could not stop. So the smoke piled on top of the fog and the air became unbreathable. Emergency services were overwhelmed. The single hospital was jammed wall to wall with patients. Children wheezing in corners, the elderly lying pale on stretchers. Nurses rushing with oxygen tanks that ran dry within hours. Doctors begged for help from Pittsburgh, but even ambulances couldn't pierce the thick fog. Some never made it into town. Others arrived too late, one rescuer recalled. "We drove blind headlights, useless. The fog swallowed everything. We could only follow the sound of coughing." Funerals began before the smog even lifted. Animals lay dead in barns, families huddled in sealed rooms, stuffing cracks with rags, praying it would be enough. But it wasn't. First deaths came quietly. An old woman clutching her chest in her parlor, a man collapsing on his porch. Then came more dozens. The official count would later settle on 20 confirmed dead in those 5 days. But the truth was far worse. Thousands were left permanently scarred. Some estimates say over 6,000 fell ill. One survivor remembered looking down his street and whispering it was as if the whole town was dying at once. Donora was choking, and the very industries that had built the town were now destroying it. But the smog had one more cruel twist when it finally began to lift. It left behind questions no one wanted to answer, questions about responsibility, questions about survival, questions about whether this could ever happen again, and in America's steel heartland. Silence followed the smoke. When the fog finally lifted, Donora emerged, broken. Skies cleared, but the damage remained. Families' mourning lungs scarred a town forever changed. And yet, the story didn't end with justice. It ended with silence. steel mills and zinc works, the very engines of Donora's economy, denied responsibility. Almost immediately, executives pointed fingers at the weather, at weak hearts and old lungs, anything but the thick clouds pouring from their own smokestacks. Doctors who spoke up or quickly pressured reports were softened, testimonies blurred. The language of blame was twisted until tragedy was rebranded as misfortune. One company official insisted this was an act of God, not industry. But God hadn't been the one shoveling coal into the furnaces. Local officials followed suit. The death toll was quietly minimized. 20 dead became the official line, though thousands were hospitalized and countless more carried permanent damage. Behind closed doors, families were told to grieve quietly, to remember that the mills fed the town, that speaking too loudly against them might cost not just a job but an entire community's survivorland. So many said nothings. Survivors who raised their voices found doors closed in their faces. Widows who asked for compensation were told their husbands died of natural causes. Workers who questioned the danger risked blacklisting. Even newspapers, many dependent on mill advertising, softened their headliness. Donora was choking not just on smoke, but on silence. For the corporations, the math was simple: a few dead, thousands sick, but the furnaces kept burning, and the steel kept selling for. The families, the math was cruel: their loved ones reduced to numbers, their grief brushed aside as inconvenient. The tragedy wasn't just the fog, was the system that allowed it to happen and then buried it beneath bureaucracy, denial, and greed. Years later, one survivor bitterly recalled it wasn't the fog that killed Donora, was the silence that followed. Because the dead had been buried, the truth had been buried with them and industry. The very machine that had choked the town marched on without consequence. But history has a way of refusing to stay quiet. And Donora's smog would rise again, not from the mills but from memory, as scientists, reformers, and ordinary citizens began to ask. The one question corporations couldn't erase: could this happen again? When the smog finally lifted, Donora did not breathe a sigh of relief. Fit wheezed. The yellow haze had vanished, but its poison lingered in the lungs. Of the people who lived beneath it, doctors soon realized that what had unfolded in those 5 days of October 1948 wasn't just a local tragedy, it was a medical catastrophe with long shadows. Thousands of survivors were left with permanent respiratory problems, chronic bronchitis, emphysema, asthma, and heart disease. Hospital wards overflowed not just in the smog's immediate aftermath, but for years to come. Every coughed, every tight chest, every wheezing child was a reminder that Donora had been changed forever. Children were perhaps the most vulnerable. Many never fully recovered, those who had been just old enough to run and play before the smog found themselves struggling to climb hills or join games of baseball. Without gasping for air, some carried the burden of damaged lungs for the rest of their lives. One survivor later recalled, "We were kids, but our childhood ended that week. From then on, we were the children who had choked." The people of Donora turned to the courts for justice. Families who had lost loved ones filed lawsuits. Doctors presented evidence of what the fumes had done, but the mills had power. The zinc works and steel companies denied responsibility, arguing the deaths were due to natural weather patterns or pre-existing illness. Lawyers picked apart medical records while local officials downplayed the death toll to protect industry. Most of the cases, collapsed compensation when it came was meager, often less than the cost of a funeral. The corporations returned to business. The families were left with grief bills and scars no one could see, but history would not completely forget. Donora became a symbol, not just of what had happened, but of what America had allowed to happen. It was proof that an entire community could be sacrificed to unchecked industry, that silence could be bought, and that death could be measured against profit margins. The town itself dwindled in the years that followed. Mills eventually closed, families moved away, but the memory of the smog never left. For survivors, every foggy morning brought panic. Every haze that rolled down the valley brought back the fear that the air itself was a weapon. The scars of Donora were not just physical, they were generational, invisible reminders of how quickly life could be poisoned when no one was watching. And though the lawsuits failed, the tragedy cast a shadow across the nation, one that would eventually force America to ask how many more towns must choke before the air itself is protected. The smog of Donora didn't just end lives, it started a movement in the weeks after the haze cleared scientists from across the country. Descended on the town, doctors carried stethoscopes and notebooks, chemists scraped samples from windowsills, public health officials interviewed the sick. They found was undeniable. The air of Donora had been laced with a toxic brew, sulfur dioxide, heavy metals, fluorides. The very byproducts of the steel and zinc mills that had powered the town also poisoned it. For the first time in American history, researchers could no longer dismiss pollution as a nuisance. Donora made it clear dirty air could kill them. Shock rippled far beyond Pennsylvania. Newspapers across the nation covered the story. Scientists demanded answers, and a quiet question began to rise among lawmakers. This could happen in one small valley town. What about New York, Chicago, Los Angeles? The U.S. Public Health Service launched one of its first major studies on air pollution using Donora as its case study. What they learned helped define modern environmental science. The lesson was clear. Clean air was not a luxury. It was survival. Still, change came slowly. Industry pushed back. Local officials resisted stricter regulations, fearing job losses. Survivors of Donora lived with illness and silence while the world debated. But the memory of October 1948 refused to fade. Each new smog incident in cities across America, from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles, added pressure. By the 1960s, the tide had turned. Public outrage, fueled by a growing environmental movement, forced the government to act, and in 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the Clean Air Act, the first sweeping federal law to regulate air quality in the United States. Was a landmark moment. For the first time, factories could not simply dump poison into the skies unchecked. The Environmental Protection Agency was created, standards was set, science had become policy, and behind it all, the ghosts of Donora Day. Donora is often forgotten, a quiet town, its population a fraction of what it once was, but its story lives in every breath we take in the cleaner skies over American cities and the laws that still govern the air. The people of Donora did not suffer in vain. Their tragedy forced a nation to confront an invisible killer. But the final question lingers. Do we remember their sacrifice as a warning, or will history repeat itself when profit once again outweighs the air we breathe? When the smog finally lifted, Donora was not the same. The mills roared back to life, the streets filled again with workers, and the headlines moved on. But for the families who buried loved ones, for the children who would carry scars in their lungs for the rest of their lives, the silence never ended. Donora became a town that lived under its own shadow, a place that choked not just on smoke but on the cost of progress. It stood as a warning, yet for years that warning was ignored. Industry thrived, officials shrugged, and survivors were left to breathe the consequences today. The story of Donora is often absent from history books. Few Americans know its name, yet its ghost lingers in every city skyline, in every law that protects us from invisible poisons, because Donora was more than a tragedy. It was a turning point, a moment when the price of unchecked progress was written in human lives. A moment when science and sorrow collided to remind us that the air itself can betray us. But perhaps the most chilling truth is this. Didn't have to happen. 20 people dead, thousands sick, an entire community scarred, not by accident but by neglect, and so we remember. Donora, a town where smoke turned to silence, a town that paid with its breath, because in Donora took death in the streets to remind the world that the air we breathe is not guaranteed.